Welcome back to Looking Outside, where we explore fresh takes on familiar topics. And what better place to do that than South by Southwest? This episode that you're about to hear was recorded live at South by Southwest Sydney earlier this year, 2025. It's a live conversation with futurist, author, ex-journalist, all-round amazing woman, Andrea Clarke. In this chat, we explore the future of the workplace, how it's being influenced by shifting expectations, the introduction of new technologies and innovation, and what's really needed in a mindset of adaptability as we think about the future of work. It was recorded in a very cool live podcast stage with a live audience, however, no video. And you'll hear me jump in towards the end to repeat back the audience questions. It's some of my favorite things to do as a live podcast. I've done it now in 5 cities. So Dubai, Copenhagen, Leipzig, Germany, South by in Austin, and now South by in Sydney. You really feed off the energy of the audience of the entire event. And also, it's a truly unscripted conversation. So we're going to dive into a really interesting topic that I think is pertinent to all of us with a slightly different lens. Enjoy. Andrea and I are both futurists by profession. Obviously, the title of the session is We Can't See the Future. So that's like a little bit of a hook, obviously, that we wanted to get people in to be like, well, if the futurists can't tell the future, who the hell can? Who would consider themselves a futurist today? Okay, so we've got about 5 people. Okay, so how about, does anybody here have a plan for their retirement? What do you want to do when you finally stop working? Hands up. Who has ever come up with a really great idea? And it can be like Kramer, right? Where you're like, this is maybe not the best idea, but I think it's a great idea. Like a bit of an invention idea. Yep. You're all futurists. You have the innate skill, the mindset, and hopefully in the future, the frameworks, the tools to apply all of that when thinking about the future. But this ability for us to anticipate what's next, to come up with ideas, to consider the impact of things, to consider the consequences, to imagine what the world could be like, is the skill of a futurist. Let's talk about change.
Okay.
Because it feels like whenever we talk about change, we're like, the world is changing faster than ever before. Everything's moving at an unprecedented rate. Is it?
Yeah, is it? Yeah. I don't know if it really is. I think the most interesting thing about change is that it has a direction and a speed, but I think at the moment we are spending a lot of time hyping both of those things, and we're spending a lot of time reading headlines in major mastheads directed by editors who are looking for clickbait. And so I think that the most important thing to understand about change is that we need to really be discerning about who's deciding on what the change looks like, how fast is it moving, and what direction it is going. I think the greatest missed opportunity about change in the workplace today, and even in our communities and families, is we're all missing an opportunity to talk about the facts about change. Because the fact about change is that we don't really like it. We are addicted to sameness, and we are obsessed with our routine. And that is why many of us here are probably ordering the same coffee every day. Put your hand up if you're ordering the same coffee every day. Yep. That's not because you're lazy. That's because that is how we are wired. And so when we are faced with fast-moving and intimidating change, particularly at work, we tend to hold on much tighter to what it is that we already know. And that, I think, is an opportunity for us to encourage our teams and anyone we're working with to be honest about how change feels, because it feels pretty clunky, it feels intimidating, it feels scary, and no one's having that conversation. Our businesses are dumping hugely intimidating tech on us today and just expecting us to engage complete autonomy around delivering that change and finding outputs for that change or the tech. And I think what's really interesting from one of my many observations, which I'm sure you've made as well, is, if you've been in the workforce for 25 or 30 years, you've showed up Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 for the last 3 decades being told what to do. And all of a sudden, we have our bosses saying, here's AI, go and experiment. Go and experiment, embed and scale. And I think that's a terrifying thought for many of us, because for the first time in our careers, we've been given personal agency, but really with no training, no guardrails, nothing at all. Only 12% of Australian businesses have any formal AI training. And we really have to ask ourselves, how well are we preparing one another and our teams to deal with this profound shift that we're seeing across the workplace? So I think the smartest thing we can do is have an honest conversation about the facts around change, because the facts are that we don't like it, we're addicted to sameness, we love our routines, and we often associate change with a loss instead of a gain. If I said to you, your boss is going to send you an email and wants to have a meeting with you at midday tomorrow, where does your mind go? Right? It does not go to, thank God I'm getting that promotion. I'm amazing. Everything's going so well for me, I'm getting promoted. I'm getting an extra $100,000 bonus this year. Unlikely. Your mind goes directly to, what am I losing in this equation? Am I losing energy? Am I losing status? Am I losing a sense of identity, financial security, resources, time? What am I losing here? So we're on default to see change as a loss. And I think we need to have an honest conversation about how much change we're facing and the fact that none of it feels like a gain at the moment. So
yeah, reframing how we think about change, but also what we're implementing to manage the change that is coming at us. I think what's interesting also, as we were talking about this, the AXA Global Risk Report came out just yesterday, and one of the stats in there was 93% of business leaders, experts around the world, are saying that they are feeling like things are happening much faster now than ever before. 93%, so pretty much everyone, right? So what tends to happen then is the CEOs, the leaders of these organizations, are feeling the sense of FOMO, right? Like, we need to keep up. Like, the world is changing, everything's more volatile, and we're living in this permacrisis world. Then we need to adapt our business faster. However, when we look at the data, we know that almost half of all CEOs are feeling like their company is not adapting fast enough. So in other words, we have company leaders that are feeling like there's a shit ton of change. Our company's not moving fast enough. Push that down through the business without potentially any kind of vision. What does our company want to be in this kind of future, right? That should be the starting point, is where do we want to go? Not necessarily how is our company going to navigate this new crisis, how do we fight this fire, but longer term, what do we want to be? What's the legacy that we want to leave behind? What kind of a company do we want to be? And therefore, how are we supporting our workforce to get to that point?
And posing the question, what is your role as an active player in change? Because I think we are all drastically underestimating our ability to change and drastically underestimating our role in change. So I think the question everyone here, I'm sure you're already thinking about it, is what is my role? Am I an active player in change, or am I a bystander in change? Now is not the time to be a bystander in change. Now is the time to have a voice on the kind of change that you want to lead, the kind of change you want to be a part of, and the kind of change that you want to see, because the future has not been decided by anyone. The future is decided by us individually, and we need to think about what kind of future do we want to be a part of. So are you a bystander? Anyone here know that they're an active player in change, actively making decisions?
Nice.
Yep. I think that's the question that no one's asking in these large businesses either. How do you want to see change play out? And what kind of decisions and behaviours can you demonstrate today that will help us get to where we want to go?
Absolutely. And we're not necessarily saying, oh no, push back and say no to things. Like, if anybody's seen that meme that's making the rounds right now about the duck being fed the Kool-Aid, it's hilarious. If you haven't seen it, you will on your feed soon. Which is basically, the Kool-Aid is AI and the duck is basically drowning, trying to drink this Kool-Aid. So I just ruined the joke. Sorry. It's actually funny. When you see it, you will laugh, I promise. But we're not necessarily saying, oh, AI is bad, you should definitely tell your business that this is a fad or anything like that, because, I think we all agree that we're living in a technological world. We believe in a super intelligent future. That's where the world is headed. But the decisions are, how do we use this? When do we use it? What for? I think another really interesting thing is what you mentioned before, which was media and the narratives around how some of this change is coming at us.
Yeah. When you think about what the future looks like, who's producing those images, right? If you do a Google search about the future of work, you see a lot of people sitting around desks wearing 3D, wearing visors or goggles and whatever else they've got there. Now, as Rihanna so beautifully put to me a couple of years ago, that's not my version of the future of work, and I'm pretty sure it's not your version either. And so how are you going to start making decisions that are going to avoid and ending up in that kind of future? Is that your preferred future of work? I think that's probably highly unlikely. So I think that, as I said earlier, now is the time to have a very active and loud voice around what you want that to look like, because the future has not been decided. Yet we all sit back thinking someone else is in charge. And I don't believe that to be the case. You're in charge of the kind of future you want to end up in. And this is why I love the Futures Cone, which I'll bring up now if you don't mind, Jo. Mm-hmm. So the Futures Cone is, anyone here familiar with the Futures Cone? You can Google it. There are about 25 different versions. Futures Cone is like basically a megaphone. And if you think about, and I call it, in a form, I call it the same game. So, and this is what we have to, this is the most important thing to understand about futures work in my very humble amateur view, and that is that great futures work doesn't start in 2040. Great futures work doesn't start in 2030. It starts today with what we choose to notice, value and act on. And so when I think about playing the same game, this is what I'm talking about. So if we show up to work every day for the next 10 years using the same technology, the same tools, having the same conversations with the same people, we will end up in what a futurist calls a probable future. Now, that's not a disaster, but it's also not amazing. I doubt anyone here would be inspired by a probable future. I would just call that average, right? So if we start making different decisions today, using new technology, experimenting with new tools, having new conversations with new interesting people, making sure our network is three-dimensional, not one-dimensional, but taking real accountability for what our habits, routines and behaviours are today. When we start shifting that today, we shift our entire trajectory. So we end up at the top of the megaphone, which is essentially a preferred future. That's the kind of future that you prefer. I call that a pretty fucking awesome future. And that's the kind of future that I want to end up in. I don't want to end up in a probable or plausible future. I want to end up in a future that I have co-created. And so if you're not familiar with the Futures Cone, I look at that every couple of days and ask myself, what am I doing today that is creating the kind of future that I want to be a part of in 15 years? And that is what I did in 2008 when I was living and working in Washington, DC. I had the most awesome job as a TV news reporter and producer covering State Department, White House, Pentagon and Iraq. And I was walking to the news bureau one day. I worked for Al Jazeera English, Pentagon Channel, and Thomson Reuters. I was walking to the bureau one day along K Street, if anyone knows DC, feeling very fucking cool, because my job every day was to bail up the Christopher Hitchens type characters, which was very intellectually stimulating. But one day I was walking to the bureau, and for the first time in my entire journalism career, I did not pick up a copy of the New York Times, because I was reading the headlines on my BlackBerry. There's nothing more stupid you can do as a reporter than walk into a newsroom without scanning the headlines before you get assigned a story for the day. So I stopped and I thought, this is really interesting. My behaviour has really changed. So the signal of change was this, that I was working. So my realisation was really simple. I was being paid to produce content as a journalist that as a consumer, I was not prepared to pay for. So if I ran that scenario 5, 8, 10 years down the track, all I could think was, I was literally stood on the pavement thinking, I'm working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week for less than $300 a day. I'm already about to be hospitalised for burnout. What does my future look like when I run that scenario, that I'm here in 5, 8, 10 years' time and I'm not paying for the content that I'm reading? What that means is that the business model of news was failing really fast, failing right in front of me, and I was a part of it. So what was I going to do that day to change the trajectory of my future? That meant resigning from a really incredibly compelling role and upskilling in another area so I could future-proof myself. So the weak signals of change are often, I think, our own behaviour. I think we need to pay close attention to what's changing in our own behaviour and not just observe that, but really value it. Value how we are behaving differently and have the courage to make decisions that lead us to or lead us along a new pathway.
It pays to think about the signals around you, to say, what have you been ignoring to get to that point? Right. And this is kind of what we talk about when we talk about the future, is you don't want to get to that situation where you're fighting the fire. You want to be preventing the fire. So you're watching the signals around you. I think it's a really beautiful reflection too, that you're doing that of your own industry. And this is often the question that we get from business leaders as well. We've been talking about the decline of media, traditional media, for a very long time. People are still reading newspapers. So things sometimes move slower than what we anticipate, but the signals are there, right? It's changing. So you're looking at the kind of the periphery and what are the influencing factors of that change. Paul Sappho, one of my favorite futurists, he says, don't confuse a clear view with a short distance. In other words, the signals are here, right? The signals are already here, as William Gibson famously said, but you're trying to understand what are the influencing factors that might propel things, right?
To give you an example of what that is for many people, I pitched an article about this profound disengagement that we're seeing across the workplace on all kinds of levels, mainly, and I pitched that without having seen the data that came out in Gallup's poll this morning about the emotional state of the emotional health of the world, purely based on what I was seeing across masterclasses that I was running. And I was told very clearly, please don't pitch us anything unless it's related to AI and job losses. Yep. And so I share that with you quite deliberately so you can be more discerning about what you are reading versus what's really happening around us. So when we talk about change, particularly external change, it's not all real. There's a lot of hype going on, and it's up to us to distinguish between hype and reality and to lead ourselves more effectively through this very tricky time in the workplace era, because I think that can help us. That is going to be, I think we need to be more decisive. We all need to exercise more decisiveness around what we're paying attention to, what we are allowing to distract us, and versus what is really going on around us in our teams, in our families, in our communities.
Yeah, more decisive and more discerning, which leads us beautifully back to the cone, right? The cone of plausibility, which in Foresight we have the 4 Ps of the future. So the probable future, which is, shorter term, what's in our immediate periphery. We go a little further out into the plausible, and then we go into the possible, right? And that's where we want to go. We're opening the aperture of what we're observing, which includes being discerning about what narratives are out there or what people want, like something that somebody else wants, the kind of future that they want. Going back to the VR goggles at my cubicle might not be what I want.
So be careful what you read, be careful what you listen to, and be careful what you believe, because usually there is an agenda that sits behind that. And I think this is part of empowering ourselves to simply be more decisive about what we're really taking in, absorbing, and then turning around in some way to the people around us.
Yeah, and I mean, all of that is coming through in the data too, because we know there's a recent Ipsos study that said 60% of workers are feeling like AI is going to be disrupting how they do their job, and then 36% saying it's going to replace our job. So the narratives around AI replacing our work are kind of fair and valid, though, because this is what happens with major technological innovations. The key thing there is obviously being aware of it, right? And then upskilling ourselves, not shying away or maybe rejecting what's happening, but really leaning in and understanding how we could be a part of that journey.
Yeah, what am I learning in this change? And every time you are confronted with something that feels uncomfortable, feels ambiguous, feels confronting in some form, the reframe is, what am I learning? What can I potentially learn in this moment where I'm resisting change? Who here knows that they're resisting something today? Anyone here resisting something today that they know they're resisting? Oh, only 2 people in the room are resisting change. Okay, right. Right, what are you resisting out of interest? Anyone want to volunteer? Taking action? Yeah. It's easy to sit in that waiting place, yeah? Return to the office,
Yes,
yeah. Welcome to the Australian market, Jo.
Yes.
Yeah, there's lots to be resisting, and of course there are a whole set of circumstances that sit around policy and mandates that I think we do need to have an opinion on. But we're all resisting something, and I think the earlier we name what it is we're resisting, the antidote to resistance is taking action. So what can we take action on, even if it's a really small step? I think that, I wrote a piece earlier this year about adaptability being the focus instead of, we're all talking about this tech transformation, but it's not a tech transformation. It's a talent transformation. It's a human transformation. It's all about adaptability because, as Jo just said, we've faced many technical revolutions before. It's never the tool. It's always the person who picks up the tool and does something magical with it. And the moment we're in now is no different to the printing press, to the internet, and to any other major development we've had.
Totally, yes. And I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole looking this up because, often when we talk about the future, we look back at the past and take the learnings and the weight of history kind of dictating what will happen. It's a lot of good learnings in there also, but it's also just really interesting and cool. So I was looking up when the telephone first came into the office, which was revolutionary at the time, by the way. It took 3 decades, 30 years to get to a point of scale. And obviously then we had the PC took half that time. The internet took, 5 to 10 years, depending on the sources that you're looking at. So the speed of adoption is getting faster. But when the telephone first came in, there were a lot of concerns. One of the ones that I thought was really interesting is how is it going to change interpersonal relationships, the etiquette of talking to each other? Because if you had to have a conversation in the workplace before, you had to actually go and speak to somebody. Also, if it was a private conversation, nobody was listening in. Remember the operators listening into every phone call, the secretary having a direct line to the CEO. There were a lot of these initial concerns around, how we relate to one another in the workplace. And I think maybe what was really interesting for me, and I looked up the telephone, the PC, the internet, I might write about this because it's just cool, fun facts around how we go through the same cycles of change. But we still talk to each other. We still, in the workplace, if you want to have a conversation with someone, you still pull them into a room, close the door, you can still do that. Yes, we use a PC, but we also still write. If you want to build a relationship with somebody, it's not always someone on the internet on the other side of the world. It is often your neighbor, right? You take the bins out, you say hello. Human to human habits that we have in the workplace or outside of it still persist.
I couldn't agree more. I think doubling down on being human is probably the greatest gift we could give ourselves. And I think if there's ever a time to be unignorable in your role, now is the time. I think we're in for a very clunky, very ambiguous couple of years until things straighten out, until the narrative calms down, until the hype evens out. And we've got to maintain a sense of our own stability through that. The most stable part of leadership and self-leading is knowing who we are. So if it's anything that I think that we need to focus on, it's really getting to know ourselves, as well as we can in the next couple of years, and staying true to those anchor points that have kept us stable and measured and sensible and not rushing to judgment for the past 30 years before AI has really blown up. I think that there's even talk at the moment about the AI bubble, lots of things, where investment's going, what investment's paying off, what's not, where is the money going to be directed next. And I think that market point of view is a really interesting point of view, which I think will end up shaping the narrative that we see across AI for the rest of the year. But ultimately it's about, I think, adapting well and adapting with intention is about amplifying what it means to be human. And we're seeing the most drastic issue that we've ever seen around connection, isolation, loneliness. So now seems like a really good time to me to really figure out what can we do to be an active player in bringing our communities closer together, in amplifying connection instead of isolating ourselves. And for many of us, that might be something really simple like organising a dinner once a month in our apartment building, organising breakfast meetups. I know that sounds like so 101, but there's nothing more powerful than knowing that we're not alone in how the current climate is making us feel. And that is pretty scared, pretty uncertain, and in a state of chronic unease. So I think doubling down on being human in whatever way that looks is really the only response, and not jumping to conclusions about how drastically our world is going to change.
Right, and change is a constant, right? So new systems will come into play and things will continue to evolve.
I have to say that people say to me, what about, when we talk about stability, stability has always been a myth. The life index scale, I don't know if anyone's familiar with that, but it's basically a stress indicator that we have 42, every single person has 42 life events that we will very likely go through. And how can we have 42 life events? Like, we get a job, we lose a job, we get married, we might get divorced. All of these standard things, really, that we go through as a human being. Like, when you look at the list of that, and if you ever search that, you'll see what is on that list. And we just can't say that stability has ever been a norm. Stability is a myth. It always has been. The only sense of stability is really that kind that we determine for ourselves. So I think when it comes to, we know change is a constant. If you think stability is, if you think stability is a norm, then I want to be in your world.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and the world is changing around you, so even if you're standing still, you're actually not, right?
Yeah.
You're falling behind.
Yeah. I spent 17 years as a news journalist working with ultra high performance news teams, being assigned to different stories every single day. And what I've learned on reflection from that is that the closer you place yourself to change, the closer you position yourself to things that are moving fast, the more resilient you become, the more adaptable you become. And so if there's any way today that you can place yourself closer to something that's changing, like if you're working at the top of a tree in a business, go down and sit on the floor, go and sit next to the cash register. If you work for a hardware store, get on the floor, talk to people. The closer you are to change, the more resilient you are going to be to what is coming next. So I think if it's anything that we can do in terms of small actions, that's one way to look at increasing our own personal adaptability.
Often when we talk about this, it sounds really bloody exhausting. That's what's going through my head, is I have to constantly be keeping up, constantly aware. This is the burden that we wear, right, in the industries that we all operate in, is that we're expected to know everything that's emerging, and it's exhausting. So there's also the flip side of that too, right, where you need to create space for some sort of a constant in your life.
I think the greatest thing we can do for ourselves is really figure out how we can manage, place and protect our energy for the next couple of years, because change is exhausting. We're all feeling it. I'm personally keeping an eye on the signals around polycrisis fatigue, which is essentially when multiple crises start overlapping. I don't believe people are burnt out from their workload. I believe they're burnt out from the world. I believe we wake up every morning, if you sleep within a metre of your phone, you pick up your phone, we're dealing with cost of living crisis, geopolitical instability, we're dealing with AI disruption, dramas in the workplace. Call it whatever you want to call it, but we've got multiple crises overlapping, and that is taking a real toll on our mental health. Australian GPs say that 71% of patients who visit them nominate the number one reason for their visit is mental health. So if you've got a team of 10, 7 of them have already seen a doctor about managing their mental health. And they may not be volunteering that, but that is the landscape of the workplace that we're dealing with. And I think that's only going to get worse. No.
It's not going to get the eyeballs.
But that is the reality of what we're dealing with, that we all feel, and we're all checking out earlier. My view generally as a freelance consultant in the Australian work market is that typically when I plan the cycle of the year, I say to myself, well, November, Melbourne Cup, Australians usually check out of work, Melbourne Cup, right, to Australia Day. And now I know, it's really funny. It's so funny, especially if you've worked in the US or in another market. And now I think it's Melbourne Cup to almost Easter. And I think for me, my busiest years are April, May, June, July, August, September. And then it really drops off. And I think that's indicative. It's a cultural thing, but also I think it's highly indicative of how completely over it. People are over it, over dealing with email, much slower to respond on email, much less interested in doing anything but the bare minimum. No judgment here. I can understand why, but you only really feel that as if you're an external consultant or a freelancer, it's hard not to take that personally, because it's your job to maintain enthusiasm 100% of every day of the year. But I think that we do get away with a lot working across corporate Australia, and the fatigue is real and the exhaustion is real. Mm-hmm. Am I alone in thinking that? Anyone here over it? Anyone here over 2025? Be honest. Oh, yeah. If we're all being honest, yeah, I feel like that's half the room.
There's also complacency. So what was really striking to me, and I mean, Andrea's alluded to it, but she's obviously come back from DC a few years ago, and I've just come back from the US, working in the head office of McDonald's, and the pace here is very different. I'm still adjusting. But one of the striking things is, the PwC CEO survey that comes out at the start of every year. I can't wait for the January edition. But, that's been saying for a few years now, but most recently that up to 46% of CEOs don't feel like their company is going to be around in 10 years. However, the striking bit for me, in Australia, the confidence of company tenure is much, much higher. It's like 76% of CEOs think that their company is all good. It's peachy keen. Mm-hmm. So I wonder, because you have this kind of, this observation that you just made, right? There's definitely an entrepreneurial spirit and a lot of really great innovation here. People come here to innovate because of maybe the contained market as well.
Or a lot of people leaving. Well, like every week leaving. I hear someone say to me, I'm moving to Singapore. I've had it. And I spent the first 5 years thinking, what have I done when I moved back from Washington?
Right.
Because I was sceptical about that decision.
Well, I wonder if there's a disconnect there then. That CEOs are like, no, everything's good, but the market is actually not innovating enough.
Well, I think it should be. I mean, if I was running the show, if I was a CEO anywhere, I would put my leadership team through foresight, strategic work, or basic futures thinking, because I'm not sure how we can say. I don't think we can say we have vision if we don't have a structured path to be in pursuit of that vision. So I think if anyone here is a leader of any number of people, do yourself a favour and look into how you can be credentialed even in foresight essentials, even in the very basics, because you can't unsee the gift that is an ability to challenge the assumptions and your own bias in a way that no one's ever confronted you with. And that changes the way you do business. It changes your level of creativity, your imagination. It changes the way you see everything. You literally walk down the street with a different lens on the world. And I think that is a base skill that we need to be encouraging across the workplace, across leadership, across teams, across anyone who's willing to think about, to reimagine and rethink the way we're doing everything.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more, obviously. Organizational training for foresight. And we're talking also equally about futures principles. So how do you lead in a time of uncertainty? How do you be an anticipatory leader is often what we talk about in foresight. You want to be able to filter that kind of mindset throughout your entire organization so that everyone's making smarter, faster decisions about the future. But then there's also more of that cultural element that we touched on before, where you're training people to take ownership of the future, right? That we have an agency in the future. The point is that you have a decision as an organization and as an organizational leader. And in Australia, so going back to futures thinking, futures mindset, skills of a futurist, and your question, in Australia, foresight is not very well known and it's not very well implemented. Globally, 40% of organizations have some sort of a foresight capability built into the organization. Now, it can sit in a dedicated foresight team like it did at McDonald's. It can sit inside of risk management or mitigation, the technology and AI team. It can live in sustainability. It can obviously live in marketing, UX. You can place it anywhere, right? Because the skills of a futurist, as you beautifully demonstrate in your work, Andrea, is as a journalist, right? Journalism is one of the core practices of a futurist. If you go back and, if anyone's wondering, yes, you can do a PhD in foresight, right? It's a proper academic practice. One of the starting points of the business application is journalism, investigating, researching, writing stories about the future, shaping narratives about the future, getting to the truth, getting to the core constant, all of these things, alongside other, obviously, fields like economics and philosophy and business management and all of that kind of stuff. But I think, like we've talked about this a fair bit. It's like where you are today and using futures thinking and futures literacy. Was it something that one day you just realized, I need to know more about this?
I think on a very personal level, I had always been running scenarios, always been running those what if scenarios, always been testing the truth about what was real versus what I was being told. And I think that was really the genesis for me, in the sort of 2008-9, that was how on reflection, I can see that those were my sort of innate foresight tools. But I grew up with a father who was a pilot. I grew up with a father who was a navigator. I was constantly exposed to maps at a very young age. And I remember so many valid lessons from listening to my dad talking about the difference between magnetic north and true north, the difference between when you're 1 degree off, if you're plotting a chart and you're 1 degree off, you burn 22 hours of fuel going in the wrong direction, and all of a sudden you're actually 1,000 miles off course. And I've used that as an anchor point for my life and being true to myself about what anchors me and the direction I want to take. I don't want to do a messy course correction at 52. So I've made very difficult decisions at a number of times in my life to make sure that I was always really anchored in my true north. And many of those times I would start asking different questions, which is what I encourage leaders to do in my work today. Because what I hear most in my work is how do I manage change, which generally indicates that it's generally a retrospective question. Something's already happened, something's gone wrong, or no one has any idea what they're doing, which is fine, right? No judgment. But I'm encouraging leaders to simply start replacing that question with a new question, and that is, how do I start anticipating change? Because when you start anticipating change and asking new questions to get new results, you start exercising foresight. You start exercising futures thinking. You start thinking differently. You start challenging assumptions that you've grown up with and the narrative that sat around your position in the workplace probably for the last 25 years. So I think we can all practice, we can all be our own futurists by simply asking that question: how can I start anticipating change in my life, in my family, in my community, in my business, in my team? What does it look like to start asking a set of new questions? How can we be all more engaged with signals of change? How do we accept what is changing, even though it's very difficult because we're human and we're highly emotional? How do I activate my enthusiasm and my energy for what is coming next by testing the truth and by questioning assumptions? And then what do I need to let go of in order to free up that very valuable brain space that I need to be prepared for what is coming next? So those are the 4 principles that I encourage leaders to think about. And I think even on that very base level, I hope that I am encouraging and promoting a futures mindset in people, because you don't need to do a PhD to start exercising some different thinking around the way things have always been done. Because that's not going to get us where we want to go, I don't think.
No, exactly. We have these kind of very static images in our head of what things are or what things have always been like, which is the last thing that I wanted to touch on in our conversation, which was the World Economic Forum's 2030 report, which I'm hoping that you guys have read. Yep, Future of Work Skills. It was so bloody refreshing seeing that, right? It's like, yes, I'm going to send this to my boss. He's going to see that the top skills in 2030, the core skills are, yes, technological literacy, but also creative thinking, resilience, flexibility, agility, curiosity, all of those things that you just touched on, right? So that's hopefully a positive sign of where things are going.
Well, that report just says to me, it's all about how we think, learn and lead. And how we do that, yes, there's an element of technical, but everything else is, I hate to use the word soft skill, but I call it the human skill, which is what encouraged me to write my first book, Future Fit, in 2018. It was published in 2019, like the 8 human skills that we need to stay relevant and competitive in the future of work, because, you didn't have to be a genius to think the workplace is going to be looser and less structured in the future. We don't know how, but it will be. And so what can disproportionately advantage you in your career? That is your ability to create value. It's your ability to get along with people. It's your ability to, be resilient and demonstrate agency in the way you can ride out moments of ambiguity and uncertainty, which of course we've all been doing for the last 5 years.
Yeah.
So I really love seeing that report because it reinforces everything that businesses should be investing in, but are really opting out of at the moment. And I think that we need to take responsibility for our own learning. And if you don't have a learning budget in the workplace, never hesitate to spend money on yourself, because learning is power. It's a form of power, and that gives you career insurance. It gives you personal agency, and it gives you the ability to have more control over the longevity of your career. When we talk about the shelf life of skills, that's getting shorter, and our career spans are getting longer. And the only way to continually close that gap is by active learning, is by being obsessed with learning. I reckon I've spent more money on learning than I have on housing in my life. Yeah, that's not impressive. A joke. And it's been worth every single dollar. And it's not just the learning, it's the alumni that you build. It's the people that you show up with for the learning. That is the real, that's the real gift, because if you've got a great learning cohort and you stay connected, you start learning in all kinds of different ways that weren't part of the curriculum that really makes it worthwhile.
And of course, we're talking about learning, unlearning, relearning, all of the learnings. Yep. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's 1 to 3% of company budgets that go towards learning and development.
Yep.
That's really, really small. So go above and beyond that, learn from different sources, including Andrea's book, which is my segue to our last 10 minutes that we have. And I'm hoping that we can give all three away. So 3 amazing questions from the audience. And we might, oh my gosh, hand shot up back there. Go for it. First up, I'm very interested in what you said about CEOs in Australia versus the ones overseas. Do you think that might be related to a more short-term view of the market in Australia? And if so, how do we get these CEOs interested in a 5, 10 or 20-year time horizon that Foresight strategy operates in? We can follow, we're kind of a bit of a follower in the market, so we can just wait things out and see what happens. The way around that, I think, is helping business leaders to understand that the future is here today, and that the future visions that we're creating are not far off, dystopic or extreme or optimistic visions. They're visions for where you want to take your company, and they're linked to decisions that you're making right now. So helping to create frameworks and processes that enable leaders to act on the future today. So, the future isn't about a 2030 vision. It's about your 12-month plan and making sure that succeeds in light of all of the things that you're not anticipating.
The CEO tenure is shortening, though. I wrote a piece on this a few months ago. The global CEO tenure is shortening because they're more exposed to being cancelled. They're more exposed to negative media coverage. There's more being asked of them, and they're simply exhausted and burnt out. I know someone who's running a big business who decided to sell out, exit, and start a dog grooming business in my neighbourhood, which is making an absolute killing, which won't surprise you at all. But the turnover of CEOs is speeding up. And so I think it's difficult for businesses to incentivise CEOs to stay on longer when they're coping with more. That's got to be done on the entry, not on the exit. So on the entry, what is the incentive for a CEO to hang around for longer than, 3 to 6 years? They're not committing to a second term. If you want to look at it from a kind of a campaign point of view, they're not committing to a second term because they know that they're going to be completely burnt out after a really difficult, even 3 or 4 year period. So I think that responsibility is on the board to incentivise longevity and a longer term horizon plan, because that involves the person at the top.
Maybe also one counter as well to that is that sometimes we think of CEOs as delivering their targets and getting their commission and delivering to the board, but they're human beings too that want to leave a legacy, right? When we think about past CEOs, we do look back, look at what they did. They want to be a part of that story. So how do we help them to embrace that and think about what legacy they want to leave behind, which is often a much longer term lens.
We really expect them to be superhuman, and they want to see their families at some point, in the tenure that they have. But I think we need to ask the question, are we expecting too much from the person at the top? Or how do we incentivise the person at the top when they leave not to take... We all know that when a new CEO comes in, he or she brings all of their own people. And that just rips out so much progress that's been made in a very short term. So how do we design for more longevity around the teams that exist because a CEO has created them?
Next question from the audience. Hopefully we agree that we have a low tolerance of long-term risk in Australia, which means change is going to be hard. Can you find or do you know of organisations that incentivise futures thinking?
Yeah, for sure. I think there are incentives linked to long-term returns for the company, sustainability targets, things like that. And that's actually maybe not a bad way to go about it, because it should be something that lives and breathes in every function. And so those long-term incentives should live inside of everything. So I definitely see it. I just don't think that people connect it as being futures thinking. They think it's just like a status quo within their area of expertise. I don't know if you've seen different...
I think leaders generally need permission. But what's interesting is those people who are ultra high adaptable, they're never asking for permission. They're reading the room. They're being courageous. They're implementing things that have a payoff and not a trade-off that extends over years. And so I think we can all find ways to demonstrate more courage around what we're introducing to a business and the long-term payoff that can have. So I think, again, it comes back to being an active player in change and what do we want our own tenure to be? And your reputation capital, what do you want said about you when you're not in the room or on the Zoom? And, what value have you created for a business that extends over, a couple of years or the short term?
You really notice it, right? When you're in a business and you have that leader in another department that is like the big picture thinker, the innovator, they're always talking about the future. They're always pulling us back to make us look further out. They're so noticeable. They're really, what's the term that you used before?
Like the unignorable.
The unignorable, yeah. And those are the leaders usually that I always would look up to and say, I want to be like that when I grow up.
And leadership doesn't have to be loud, but it does have to be original, I think.
Yeah.
Last question from the audience. So you've talked about this industry of being busy, I guess, and how technology is meant to help us to be more productive, but actually we're feeling more burnt out from being more busy. I'm interested in your views on how you think workplaces and our culture are going to adapt to the backlash to that.
Backlash to being busy? Yeah. I think there already is a backlash, and that's probably what's prompted the question, because busy was a badge of honour. Is that what they used to say? I think busy's been boring. Busy is so boring, isn't it? And I'm not sure how businesses are going to design for it, but what we all should be doing is encouraging and promoting ways to encourage our teams to be more honest and transparent about what productivity looks like and what it really means, because I think that we're all probably preoccupied with meeting expectations of a business that aren't real. So when are we all going to get real about how much we can do in a day?
Yeah, I think this is very much linked to the productivity discussion as well, which Australia is a little bit obsessed about at the moment. I mean, the world is obsessed with the productivity conversation, but Australia is really far behind on productivity. And maybe I want to be an effective worker versus a productive worker.
Yeah, I think that's the opportunity that we all have, and I think we need to be just more realistic about what we can fit into a day. I know that I'm obviously a freelance consultant, but if anyone hasn't read Cal Newport's book, highly recommend it. Right, I can see if you have, you feel strongly about it. But one of those principles is do less. And when you actually really own that principle, and when you can find a way to exercise that, it really does change the game. Because when we're just not built to deal with 100 million pieces of information a day, and so it's a very personal thing, but I think that is a way we can be a more active player in change in our lives, is to be decisive about how much we can do and how much is just simply unrealistic.
Yeah, beautiful way to end on is a little bit of pragmatism when we're talking about the future. So thank you so much for being an engaged group. And Andrea, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Jo. Thanks, everyone. Great to see you. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, or share the show, and I will see you next time. Until then, keep looking outside.